Welcome, everybody, to the Ambition to Impact podcast. Today, I am joined by John Irvine. And I want to introduce you to someone who actually, coincidentally, we used to work unbeknowingly in the same office together, which we discovered when we were having a chat. So presently, John is transitioning out of his US-based role as the Chief Financial Officer of Current, which is a position he's held since 2016. And he's returning to the UK shortly. So at the moment, it is we're recording this in May. He's returning to the UK in July. So we're going to have to give you a bit of a welcome back. And he's looking for his next role there. He'd been with GE for over 20 years, and he joined Current when GE created the new energy business, which offered LED lighting, solar power, battery storage, all really fantastic products and solutions to buildings and cities around the world. And really, he was a real part of establishing the new business and the finance function there. So John remained with that business to carve out the sale to an American industrial partner and middle market private equity firm in 2019. And John had an integral role there in establishing the standalone business, so replacing GE IT, GE Finance, and the other corporate resources and systems, in setting up that new board operating all of the reporting rhythms and developing that new growth. And it's not just that. So that's a whole skill in itself. But prior to that, John has extensive global experience. And in terms of being all over, in terms of consumer, commercial, real estate, financial services, in GE Capital. And John served as financial officer for GE Capital Australia and New Zealand, in Melbourne, Australia. And then he was CFO for GE Capital Asia and real estate in Asia, based in Tokyo in Japan, and the FP&A leader for GE Capital Global Banking, and CFO officer of GE Corporate Finance Bank, both in London, UK, Paris, and France. And he has significant M&A experience, having been involved in the acquisitions and dispositions and JVs throughout his career. And even before that, John was traveling the world and working for GE Capital Europe in 1999 and GE Financial Management Program. And the list goes on, John. You've been, and not including, and prior to that, you've worked in Rotterdam as well. So we're adding so many countries and so many cultures you've worked with in terms of, and being a really vital part of that finance function. What do you say? I mean, I don't even know where to start with key challenges in working in so many different countries. How have you found that now that you're returning back home finally after this huge journey?
Yeah, it's a 25-year round trip, I think. I think I left university, went to London, because I went to university in Scotland, in Glasgow. And so it's a sort of a 25-year round trip coming back, I guess, in one regard. And but yeah, I think a lot of it is you've got to go in with a bit of an open mind and be prepared for the fact that, a lot of the things that you're used to doing and the way things that you work at home don't always work the same overseas. And even where you think, there are similarities in certain ways that different people in different countries think, but there's still underlying differences. And, very often in some countries, people think very structured ways, and in other countries, it's very, they can deal with a lot of uncertainty, and, the end vision might not be so good and they can figure it out. But in other cases, they really are, very structured, and things have got to be very clear and laid out. And so you get accustomed to the fact that you encounter different people and the different ways they think about things. But I think it's important to go in with an open mind and realizing that, the way that it works when you're at home doesn't necessarily always work when you're overseas.
So when was the first time you realized that?
I was fortunate enough. I'd spent a lot of time the financial management program and GE Capital Audit, GE corporate audit staff that I spent the first 8 years in GE in. I worked pretty much all over Europe, Asia, North America, and going across their different business units, and that was their leadership program that they had. But it's most pronounced when you go into places like parts of Asia, where the cultural etiquette in terms of formality, seniority, how you get things done becomes very evident. And then I was fortunate the last 2 years I spent living in Tokyo. I was covering Asia. So, in addition to sitting in Tokyo and living in Japan, I had responsibilities for Australia, India, China, Korea, Southeast Asia, so you were going into those countries at different times and just realizing, very different ways sometimes of thinking and doing things that you had to get accustomed to. But Japan, I had 2 stints in Japan, and Japan is interesting because sometimes the formality and the seniority and the way that things work. And so I think when we were talking before, I mentioned this concept they have called nemawashi, which is the meeting before the meeting, so that, when you want to get something done, you can't just turn up to the meeting and go, right, boom, here's how we're going to get it done. You figured out, actually, if you wanted to get success in the meeting, you had a bit of groundwork to go and do. Now, that's frankly true in a lot of places, but Japan actually has a word that references the meeting before the meeting, as they call it. But it's just about getting people on side. But formality and seniority was very important. And but in different countries, you come across different examples of aspects. And I think one thing you figure out is you learn a lot more about yourself and your own culture, because you go abroad thinking, well, this works here, so I'm going to do it this way. Then you realize, actually, when you're sitting in a different country and people think, who is this, foreigner who thinks they can come in and tell us how to do things? So it challenges you a lot of how you think about the ways to get things done. And you probably learn a lot more about yourself and how you do stuff than perhaps sometimes as much as you learn about the country that you're in.
It's interesting, is it? You're reminding me of my, I think, first, I mean, when I was at GE, so I was the only person on my team in the UK. We were across GE Europe in terms of European division of GE Corporate. And I remember learning, I really had to learn fast about tone of voice in terms of trying to get things done and not feeling offended if someone was very abrupt. And also, of course, English is my first language, but it wasn't for pretty much the whole of my team. and all of those kind of communication issues that happened there. But one thing I was really interested in is, of course, you were saying about the certain ways, like we've got culture, we've got people, we've got ways of doing things. But the one thing, of course, that unites you is that finance function piece. And you were just saying about the fact that sometimes there's this uncertainty, and sometimes there's there's things we don't know. And I imagine especially over all this 25-year round trip, there's been a lot of uncertainty, certainly in the last few years. There's been a lot of trying new things, and with G Current, with a new business and separating that out, and there's new things to try out and put together. So I think where I'm going with that is that the one thing that unites you is that finance function. And when we think about finance function, we're thinking about the part of a business that creates certainty. But how does that feel when there is uncertainty there?
Yeah. Well, I'll pick up on one thing you said. Obviously, I never had any problem with accents and getting understood overseas. If I think there's a lot of people who thought English was my second language as well at times. But yeah, no, that's, I mean, all the way through. And I again, when we were speaking previously, I'd given some examples. When I came through the financial management program and audit staff prior to 2008, when, if you remember for those of you old enough, the world economy was going in only one direction, which was up. and everybody seemed to be, growing, making money, and it was sort of that honeymoon period. And then, of course, we had, first of all, it was Bear Stearns in the summer, and then it was Lehman. And I had just taken my first job in London, kind of split between London and Paris with Corporate Finance Bank, which did lending to private equity. And that is when GE Capital obviously hit a bit of the challenge with its external funding and the corporate paper market. And so I just remember us sitting in the business, and the instructions are coming down about how managing your daily cash flow and how much are we lending, and what open commitments did we have on credit, and how are we managing those with our various clients. Now, there's an element where you're trying to balance. There's clients in a similar mode of potential, I don't want to call it crisis, but panic about what they're going through. So you're trying to make sure you can support your customers, but at the same time, you're equally trying to make sure that you're remaining in business. And so, a lot of these things, it's just about having a level head, trying not to panic. What do you control? And then going in and, part of the, some people like it, some people don't, is going in and just figuring out, what have I got to do, and figuring out quickly. But understanding what you control and what you don't is a key part of that. And as I say, we went through this. The first role, bit of a baptism of fire, was going into the whole financial meltdown that came with Lehman. But then throughout the career, it's been, we've had restructurings, business sales, acquisitions, and of course all of those events. An acquisition, if you're the acquirer is a could be seen as a great thing in terms of growing your business. If you're the acquired company, your immediate thought is, will I have a job tomorrow? Am I going to get part of some layoff? So there's elements of these things where, particularly in leadership roles, you're looking at how do you bring some degree of certainty to your team. Communications equally important, getting in front of people, and sometimes getting in front of people and telling them what you know and what you don't know may or may not help them, but at least they see you in front of them, and understand where you are. Because when there's no communication in a vacuum, people fill it with their own ideas of what they think is happening.
That's a really good point, isn't it? It's when we don't hear from leaders.
So we've always had, I've always usually ended up with I found sometimes the formal town hall can work, but other times it's the informal. One of the things I used to do in my role here in Current was always, when I was going down to Cleveland, which was where our main office was, I just go down and buy some, so it's in the US, so I just go buy some donuts and coffee. I'm sure it'd be tea and scones if I was in London, but the donuts and coffee here, and it'd just be, let's get together and have the team and I do a little, here's an update of where we are, and then what are people's questions, and so it's that important piece of having connection with their leader and what's going on. But equally, as I say, as you pointed out, sitting in finance, whether it was Lehman and what are your positions in terms of draws and cash needs and funding needs and draws that are going on back in 2008, or it's the current business I was in. We March 2020, COVID struck. Now we'd seen some of it coming early, because if you recall, we've got a lot of sourcing and teams sitting in China, so we got the early kind of wind of what was happening. But nobody really thought it was coming, so to speak, this way until it came, and then everything locked down, and you went back into a mode whereby you're figuring out what's the potential scenario in terms of your top line and your costs and your cash, and really that mantra of cash being king becomes the critical piece. How are you getting funded? What is the bank supporting you? What have I got day to day? How do I staunch outflows? How do I make sure I've got inflows to pay everything? What other things can I do? And that's where, as a finance function, to say the critical thing is not panicking. If you panic, one, it rubs off on your team, and two, you're probably doomed, because you can't get clear thinking about what's going on. So, first is to stay level-headed and realize that, you think your way through it and realize there's other people in the same position. You need to move fast, but not rash. And then you've also got to make decisions. So I think the other thing that a lot of frustrates people at times is when you prevaricate. At some point, you've just got to accept that you won't have 100% of the information. You'll make a call. Again, our role in finance is coming up with the data and information, and we try to model and scenario, but we can model and scenario to the eternity. And the only thing that sometimes is going to be true is that it may be wrong. You just hope it's not going to be too wrong, and you got to go with what you know and make a decision and move forward and accept it might end up being wrong. And if it's wrong, learn from it, but don't dwell in it, but learn from it and move on.
So it's really what I'm really interested in, as you said, is, try not to panic. And I imagine at that point when you got kind of this whiff that something was happening, and we've had regular things now happening in the last few years, and it's proving wearing from pandemics and lockdowns, and of course then that spreads throughout different countries, and one country, lockdowns in China and Hong Kong affect things elsewhere, and in the US that affects it elsewhere, and in the UK and Europe there's this kind of ripple effects that keep happening across the world. The war in Ukraine that has a ripple effects. So one question is if you are feeling this sense of panic happening, and what did you do? How did you bring that back down to being level-headed for you?
Yeah, so maybe that's easier said sometimes than done. But I think, one aspect I've always found is that, sometimes when it's very easy to feel that, you've got to be at your desk 24/7 because of that, crisis. And I think sometimes what's actually helpful is just to step away for a minute. Well, maybe not a little bit longer than a minute, but that stepping back, and just whether it's and switching off from the problem, right? That doesn't mean, you go away and forget about it for a week, but that 30 minutes, whether it's because you want to go to the gym or you'll watch something, but just that act of stepping back and, gives you some chance to get perspective and think about it. But it also becomes key in terms of, knowing that a part of it is understanding you've got a good team around you, and that, so there's an element of building good teams, recruiting good people, coaching them, and knowing that when, the problem strikes, you've got a good cadre of people who you can rely on to work with you. You'll also find, as I say, that you're not usually the only person going through it. So one advantage we had in all of the different things, whether it was when I was in GE, there was other parts of the company. It was a great network of people, of like, you could pick up the phone to anywhere in the world and go, hey, you're doing this as well. What's going on? In the private equity world, it was a little different, but they had portfolio companies. And so they're going through the same issue with COVID. And it was, so they were very quick in terms of how they could share best practices and other approaches. And you could talk to other CFOs if you needed to say, hey, how are you approaching this? So there's an element of realizing that you're not the only person usually sitting in the problem, and you probably aren't the only person who's ever gone through it. It's just whether you've then got enough of, whether it's a network in the company you work for, or a network in the professional industry, or wherever it may be, are there other people out there that you can go and solicit ideas from, and suddenly realize, hey, hang on a second, I'm not here on my own figuring all of this out. There's other people who are, able to help, contribute, give you ideas. I think it also helps, and look, this comes from just experience. When you're, if you're a year into your career versus 20 years into your career, there's an element of just, hey, look, you've gone through a number of things, and therefore, all right, look, we figured this out before. We know how we went around it. So let's, go work our way through it. And it's just about putting your plan in place. What do I know I control? What do I not control? And, if some of those things that I don't control happen, what may or may not be my response or reaction? And then making decisions, realizing there's imperfect information, and and moving forward. But I can't emphasize enough the importance on your team is like, because I say, if you look like you're panicking, you can be sure your team's going to panic. So that's never a good look. It also helps to keep them stable. And likewise, they're hopefully working to their best intentions and the best of their abilities to address the situation too. So the importance for you is how do you coach and support them in getting through it as well. It's not actually all about me, so to speak, as much as I've recruited a team, I built a team. How are they going to work to get us through it? And realizing that those touch points, connections, whether it's one-on-one, town halls, small get-togethers, going through it, particularly if there's an extended situation, is just as important in terms of bringing people along with you and realizing they've got support as well.
So an interesting thing you just said is about how you do that. So I'm going to have to ask you, how do you do that in terms of bringing people along with you? How do you keep them connected, motivated? And most importantly, you said not to show that panic, but we have to recognize that especially leaders will feel panic inside of them. Was that something natural to you that you could go, you sound so level-headed when you're chatting. So was that something that came naturally going, I am panicked, but I'm not going to show, I'm going to deal with that. I'm going to have that time out.
Yeah. I mean, there may be elements where it's just maybe part of your character. I don't tend to go up and down. I'm somebody who doesn't necessarily, just in the same way that like, a lot of people always joke with me because, something great happens. And of course, I've never been the guy who got, super excited and, thank people for their contribution. But, I won't be the high-fiving person running around the office celebrating. But equally, the flip side of it is I'm, not necessarily the person who gets, down and look, every challenge is an opportunity, right? Everything that comes along is an opportunity to solve or something to stretch you. So I think an element of it is flipping around. It doesn't make it any more pleasant when you're in the middle of it, I have to say. I mean, they're not, some of these situations aren't like things that you'd say, oh, well, that's great. Let's go over there and find a really horrible problem that's going to be in the middle of it. Not a lot of fun to work through. But I think with a lot of your team, and look, a lot of times when I've done the acquisitions, dispositions with my team, one of the things I tell a lot of them, and I think they've all benefited from as they've gone on, is, it's a great opportunity to learn about, whether it's M&A or projects, or there's a set of skills that you get from that opportunity. And as you again go through building your career, look at some of these things as, whether you want to put it on your resume or CV doesn't necessarily matter, but it's an opportunity to build some skills and do some things that other people wouldn't. So when the business that I was in, when Current was split out of GE, it was for a lot of people, they'd been in GE for decades. In some cases, right? That it was one of those companies where, you went and you sometimes stayed for a long time, which, I did. And there's an element of like, well, what's going to happen when we leave? But you say, well, look, working through all of this is an opportunity to, get a different experience in the private equity world. It's a very complicated carve out of cutting out the business from all of the GE infrastructure and decades of linkages. And not a lot of people get to go through that opportunity. So there's some things to go and learn from that experience. So there's an element of trying to focus on the end result. Not necessarily, if you remember when your kids going on long journeys, it wasn't necessarily sometimes the sitting in the car, are we there yet? There was the fun bit. It was knowing that maybe there was a beach or whatever it was you were going to, or a theater or a cinema or something at the end of it. But it's a little bit the same in business sometimes. The journey there, you may as well enjoy it because you got to do it. But it may not necessarily be fun, but focus on the end result and where you're trying to get to, and the advantage to people of going through it, right? It's a little bit like, life is a bunch of experiences. Well, careers are also a bunch of experiences, and that opportunity to do some of the things that not everybody gets to do. It's if you told somebody, hey, you're going to do an account reconciliation for the next 30 years, that could be really critical for the business, but it's not going to be hugely exciting at the 50th time of doing it. But hey, if you've still got to do that, but actually, hey, I want you to go figure out how we set up a new reporting mechanism, or how are we going to actually disconnect ourselves from, the system that funded the business, or we had to go, when we split out, we had to go figure out setting up a treasury and cash process. We had to go take ourselves out of an existing ERP. We'd actually go replace all of our reporting systems and consolidation tools and so on. And I was, oh my God, it's a lot of work. And you go, it is a lot of work, but actually there's not a lot of people who actually get that opportunity to go and do it. So I think it's an element of trying to help people understand that, yeah, it's hard work. Sometimes it'll be long hours. Sometimes it won't be particularly fun if you're sitting at 2 a.m. trying to figure it out. And sometimes that happens. But it's actually, what is it doing for you from a development and career and experience perspective that, will the benefits of it come sometime down the road, hopefully, if you do it. And that's a lot of the times when I've looked at the different opportunities that I was given. I had when we went to Japan in 2011, we actually had an option to go. There was a job in Tokyo and a job in Watford. And I had nothing against necessarily going to Watford. But the other thing was, in Tokyo was right after the earthquake in Fukushima. And so I had personal reasons to go, because my wife's actually Japanese. And so we were, it was trading the sort of, our family were there and everything was fine. And they were both great jobs and opportunities. And, we took the option to go back to Tokyo, both with great jobs. But and it was also just the fact of, like, again, well, here's a completely different culture and environment. And yes, I'd been there before in an Asia role, everybody spoke English, but this one included actually managing a piece of the Japan business and, having to interact with a team each day where you don't really speak the language. I resolutely tried learning Japanese. Got a little bit along the way, but it's not that easy to learn when you're working as well. But it's that opportunity to say, look, not everybody wants to jump on a plane and go to a different place, or go, hey, I want you to go here because there's a different problem to go look at. It sometimes looks like it's much more fun to go to I'll go to the business that's growing really fast, it's nice and stable, and there's nothing going on there. And sometimes that's great, but again, my experience, at least in GE, was your spurs were often developed more by taking the tough assignments. And that's why, for me, it was interesting to go see internationally, but equally, it was different opportunities that led us around the world to different places and things that, if I went back 20 years ago, I'd never thought I would have been doing.
It's interesting because you've talked so much about that being that level-headed side of you and the calm, not the high fiver, but also okay, this is a problem, but actually let's look at this like an opportunity. And there's this really calm element to you. But clearly there's also a part of you that's a real adventurer and explorer. Like, you haven't shied away from stretching yourself and stretch projects, from taking on problems and not seeing them as problems, seeing them as opportunities to solve something, and not being afraid to potentially fail. Would you say that's right?
That's probably true. And I think, that's something I think it drives, personally for me, is like, there's an element which is a desire to be challenged, but equally something that always drives you is a fear of failure. Now, that doesn't mean you can't make mistakes, but there's always a fear that fear of failure, I think, drives you. And it's funny, we're going to talk a little bit in one of the books that I talked about, and the individual in that book talks a little bit about that as well. And it's that, fear of failure that sometimes drives you. And approaching it again, sometimes the fear of failure makes you lead to rash decisions or panicking. But on the other hand, I think it's balancing the fact that, look, every challenge is an opportunity, all right? Every difficult situation is something to go learn from. You've got to have confidence that, the skills that sometimes you've developed over your career, you can take them and apply them. And yes, you got to go learn new ones. As I've been spending a little bit of time recently trying to, get through, automation and blockchain and AI, and what does that actually do in the finance function? And I grapple with the question. It's digress for a second. I grapple with the question of, well, is my first priority fixing the process, or is it automating it? Because a lot of times I wonder, am I automating a bad process, right? Is there a different way to do the process that actually automating it wouldn't solve? Or am I just automating a bad process? And I think for a lot of finance leaders, that's an interesting challenge, because all of these RPA people are telling you, no, you should get all these bots and you should go automate it. And, there's clearly a big opportunity there. But at the same time, you go, well, great, but am I automating a bad process? So you got to go think about, so some of those things around just challenging the way you think about stuff and go do it. And that's to say, when you go into a new role, learn fast. One of the corporate audit staff that was a big piece. And, there's some really great people who have come out of that program and probably well ahead of me from a career point of view in terms of what they've achieved. But a big piece of what that role was about was, 4 months in a business, go quickly learn about the business, go and execute and figure things out. And, a lot of when I go into jobs nowadays, you take a lot of the same things around how do you quickly go in, quickly get the lay of the land, how do you execute and start contributing while you're still learning? And then, as I say, when challenges come up, can you think of it again in the moment? It's tough, but can you think of it as, what's the opportunity? What is it I'm gonna learn? And we had a lot of tough moments in my current role, carving out and COVID and markets do this and do other things, and we'd right at the very beginning, we'd all these grand ambitions about how electric vehicles and solar and battery storage and energy efficient lighting would all come together.
Which should very much have done at that time.
But the reality was we were probably a little too ahead of the market, right? There was tons of interest, and maybe we were 5 years too early. We'll never know. Maybe there was execution missteps that we made. Again, you look back, could have maybe there's something done differently, but at the same time, it was a great experience in terms of creating a new business, and we absolutely believed in what we were trying to do. But
thinking you went on another adventure there.
But so something
one of your adventures
off. And then you look now and you go, great, like if you maybe you look at the market now and green energy and you say, we just needed to persevere. But time
it's always interesting, isn't it, that balance between knowing when to step back and when enough is enough, and when you're personally not just looking at all the data, but also listening to your instinct about what the right thing to do is, and step back, or is at that point where actually I just need to, almost what you said earlier, stop, have a break, more than a minute, and just recoup and see what needs to happen next. But it goes back to that failure, which actually you mentioned about the person, of course, you've selected in the book for the Leaders Library. So right now is where I'm going to ask you, what book did you choose and why for the Leaders Library? What's the biggest lesson?
So I picked Alex Ferguson's biography. Now that's partly, I guess, a kinship there with fellow Glaswegian, but so I would say to people, look beyond. I'm sure if you read it, if you're a Manchester United fan, you think it's great. If you're not a Manchester United fan, but I would look at it less from the angle of the team and the sport, but just looking at him as a manager and some of the insights he offers and his way of thinking, particularly in how interesting, building teams of international players, and talks about some of the different cultural aspects of it. The fact that he said, look, we would never ever, push up, publicly, call out a player for their performance, but in private, would have a clear conversation with them on how they did. That drive to succeed. And then even when, for all the fact that people think about, his success as a manager, he'll tell you about the barren spells when self-doubt comes in, they aren't succeeding. How do you get beyond maybe a losing spell when things didn't work out? And I had plenty of occasions when things haven't worked out, and we've had to go back to the drawing board. And it's having a bit of that belief that you're going to persevere. If you believe you've put in place the right team and the right structures and the right processes, can you turn things around? So I would look at it as the elements of him as coming through and kind of, his early career and some of the things he had to do versus when he got to Manchester United at a much bigger budget. Clearly that helps. But I think it's some of the nuggets just in how he as a manager thought about managing people, building teams, success and failure, because he talks a lot about the finals that he lost or the games where he lost out, and what they went and did when they failed. They go figure out, well, what do I learn from it? How do I do differently? So that period in the early thousands, they won the European Cup, they won the Premier League, they'd won the treble. Then they actually hit a bit of a barn spell, and he talks about how, there was a point at that time when it was like, oh, he's past it, and he should really go. But he talks about, hey, we really believe we were in a rebuilding phase, and look, I guess history might be kind, right? So the benefit of hindsight is it all came good. But I think, as I say, if you're reading a book and looking at it more from a manager of a team and a manager of performance, which a lot of us have to do, and his use sometimes of data on performance as well, right? He doesn't talk too much about it, but he does make reference to, he talks about in the final how they'd done, comparing himself with the competition, and so when you're preparing for a game, when we're competing in markets, well, what were Arsenal doing? What were Chelsea doing? How are we going to go and defeat them? What was their mindset? And then in the final, I think he talks about 2008 when they were against Chelsea. They'd gone and got videos and studied every Chelsea player's penalty taking, so that when it actually turned into penalties, and there's a game of luck in there in penalties, but they had prepared. Now, a lot of people do that today, but I just go back to the parallel of competing in markets. What are your competitors going to do? What are they thinking about? How are they going to react to some of these things? What does that mean for you? So I look at it more on the parallels for being a manager of people and a business, as much as he was a manager of a football team managing bunch of some stars, let's call it.
But it's managing performance at the end of the day, regardless whether it's in sport. And as you say, those parallels are so prevalent in how organized leaders and organizations also work in terms of managing teams, looking at markets. I love those parallels. What a great suggestion there. And you have to have a fellow Glaswegian as well. So very apt. Very apt and a great selection. So for anyone, if you're listening, then just head to the Leaders Library. I'll put all the notes and the details of that in the show notes, so you can get access and read John's selection there and learn about Alex Ferguson and his abilities as a leader. And I think always it's about that, being able to fail, having the resilience to get back up. And actually, John, you went back to saying about that this is a period of reconstruction. And that goes back to what you said about your career is a series of experiences and events. And never think of it as one thing and the other. It's always, okay, this might be, if it is a down period, or if there's something happening in the market, or if there's something happening globally, then this is just a part of the journey. This is just leading to that next step. And when we think about that bigger picture, sometimes it can feel less overwhelming and more like an adventure.
Yeah. Resilience these days is, it comes up a lot, but resilience is a key trait, I think, for a lot of leaders in terms of how you deal with adversity and then recover from it. And you always have to reflect on it. But, if you get in I had a very early incident in my career where, something hadn't worked out. And, somebody come in, no, you should stick at it. And it was a real factor in the thing, because if I had decided another way, I would have probably never done the career that I had, but I stuck at it, and then here I am. And, I've equally had, I'm sure if you go around and ask all the people work with, there's been things when I've done well and things when I haven't done so well. But it's that point about resilience, because at that moment in time, I was like, this is just not going to work. I'm just going in the wrong direction. It's not what I want to do. So you had the conversation, you pick yourself up and you move forward. And I say that component of resilience. And I think that's also an element where I've been fortunate to work with some great leaders. That's one of the helpful things that came around being in GE. But there's been some really great people who've been coaches, mentors, supporters, and I can't emphasize enough to others who are listening that getting yourself a good manager, coach, mentor makes a really big difference, I think, in terms of, is it the right opportunity? Should I go do this? Is this is this the thing I should go work on? And when you're in a tough time, there's somebody that's there that you can put a call into. I talked about calling other people in a similar position, but equally, there's people who somewhere have gone through it. And are they willing to pick up, can you pick up the phone or the email and have a conversation? And that can also be a big help too.
So what I'm summarizing from the entire conversation here now is that actually the big lessons you've learned and taken with you is to build on that resilience and understand, how to deal with panic, and when panic arises, how to constantly stretch yourself and make sure you're expanding your skills. Equally, when it comes to learning different cultures and communicating with different cultures, and also just to ask for help as well, have those connections and be honest, be almost an element, you didn't say it, but an element of vulnerability with what you don't know as well as what you do know, but just be there, be present, be in front of people, regardless of if you think you have the right answers. So this sounds like massively valuable lessons that you've taken with you in your career. And it sounds like an exciting point in your next adventure, coming back here, back to the UK, and whatever the next thing is for you.
Yeah, that'll be the next culture shock, is returning to the country after all. I mean, my parents are still there. I still go back, but 11 years returning. So it'll be an interesting return. And my children have never lived there. They've obviously been and visited, so they're looking forward to it. But it'll be an interesting, just as everywhere else we've gone. It'll be a new experience and new friends and new whatever for them as well.
New places. That'll be exciting. Well, thank you so much for coming and chatting to us today. And yeah, signing off. Are there any last words to give to everyone out there in terms of leadership?
No, I think, as I say, you summarized it well. So I'm going to leave it at that. And yeah, great. Thanks for inviting me on and giving me the opportunity to share.
Thank you.